Well, let's go ahead and get started. We're talking about two servants tonight. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend 15, 20-ish minutes, hopefully no less, no more than that, maybe even a little less, talking about Cyrus the Great. And then we'll go on to one passage. We're just dealing with one passage tonight, and that is what's called the suffering servant passage, and that's in Isaiah. Starts in the last three verses of Isaiah 52. So we'll be in there. But first I want to start off because really there are two, as the book of Isaiah begins to come to a close, there are really two figures, if you will, that consistently loom over the discourse. One is this foretold servant, which we've mentioned. It's these prophecies about the Messiah, prophecies that we as Christians believe are realized in Jesus Christ. But there's this other figure, and he is named, given by name, as Cyrus the Great of Persia. And they are both, in very real ways, saviors, deliverers, and they are both anointed. But the way in which they accomplish their mission is completely different. And so I thought it would be an interesting way to compare, rather than separate them, to actually sort of teach about both of them in the same evening and see if that's sort of drawn out some interesting comparisons. So let's go ahead and take a look at Cyrus the Great. So that's not him. That is his tomb, which still exists, by the way. It's in Iran, where you can go see it. It's still there. It's one of the wonders of the ancient world. So Cyrus the Great, let's talk a little bit about him first. He was the Persian emperor from 559 BC to 529 BC, and he's the founder of what's called the Achaemenid dynasty, You don't need to worry too much about that, but let me get into how he sort of came into being. He came into being, like everybody comes into being, by beating up and taking over his neighbors. His big win is in, according to your notes right there, we look at his list of conquests, is when he takes over the Medes in 550 BC. So essentially, he's just this little local warlord down here in Persia. And if you know your modern maps, you know this is modern-day Iran right here. Okay, you see the Iranian plateau, you see the Caspian Sea, how it all works together. Okay, so here in Pasargadae, I don't really know how to say it, he establishes his capital here, and he is from this region in here called Asan. And what he does is he starts to sort of reach out, and his first conquest, 550 BC, is over the Medes. Now, if you've ever heard the phrase, the Medes and the Persians, or the Medo-Persian Empire, that's the beginning of this. This is actually sort of foretold-ish in the book of Daniel. If you know anything about the book of Daniel, there's this incredibly powerful prophecy where Daniel has this vision of a statue, and the statue is made of different elements, different metals and different materials, right? And so the first, all the way down to feet of clay. And so some people interpret that as the Assyrians, who are then conquered by the Babylonians. And in the middle, the iron part, I believe it's the iron part. I'm doing this off the top of my head, so I don't remember. Please no one look it up. Just embarrass me later. The middle, though, is the Medes and the Persians, okay? And there's all sorts of little sayings about the laws of the Medes and the Persians and all that. But that's who this is. From there, then, he goes up and over the north and comes up to Lydia, which is basically Turkey, modern-day Turkey. So that's in here. Now, think about that. He covered a lot of ground very quickly, because this happens just about 4 years later. He's over here, and in Sardis, he defeats King Croesus. Now, some of you may know Croesus because people are as rich as Croesus. Has anyone ever heard that? I know it's an old-timey saying. Go watch some old like Disney cartoons or old Bugs Bunny cartoons. They'll talk about it. Maybe the wealthiest king to have ever lived until Cyrus took his milk money, okay? So they come all the way up. Now, it's after this, things sort of settle down, and then in 539 BC, in this town right here that's called Opis, the armies of Cyrus defeat the armies of Balthazar at the Valley of Opis. And that is the story that is told in Daniel 5. Okay? If you don't know what that story is, that's the story of the handwriting on the wall. Okay? So let me turn there real quick because it actually sort of plays it out kind of interestingly. I wasn't planning on doing this, but I think it's just kind of a great story. And it's just great because I love it when biblical like you can just point to, oh, there it is right there. Okay. I'm not going to read the whole story, but 5:1 says, King Balthazar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of 1,000. Essentially what they were doing is they knew they had a battle the next day, and this was essentially their last great festival before the battle, because they knew they were probably going to lose. The king of Babylon at the time was a guy, if I remember how to pronounce his name, it's like Nabonidus or Nabonidus or something like that. Balthazar is his sort of ruling in his stead. Nabonidus had already died. They know they're going out. They know they're going to lose. Now, we know this date to be somewhere in October of 539 BC. I think it was like around the 29th. Literally, if I did my notes right, it was like Sunday night. So they're partying on a Sunday night, and that's the problem. They should have been at church, right? And so this hand shows up on the wall, and it writes something on the wall. No one knows what it is. They say, go get Daniel. Daniel shows up, and he says this. It means this. The writing on the wall, verse 25, was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered, because it sounds like the Aramaic word for number, numbered your days. Tekel, you have been weighed, which is the same as, they're just word plays. But that idea of Parsin was a play off Paris, which was the Persians. So he's saying your days are numbered, they've been judged, and it will be the Persians that eliminate you. Now, Daniel says it's Darius, but it is in fact Cyrus is the king at this time. No one really knows who Darius is, but Cyrus is the king. So he takes over Babylon in 539 BC. At this point, the Jews are in Babylon. They've been in Babylon for about 60, 70 years at this point. Why does this matter? Because according to the book of Ezra, he orders the rebuilding of the temple in 538 BC. Because it says, in the first year of his reign, King Cyrus sent a decree that the Jews would be allowed to go back and rebuild their temple. Okay. So there's two ways now of looking at this situation. One is your normal historical geopolitical events of the day. Cyrus is actually lauded as sort of this incredibly enlightened ruler. He basically instituted, for the most part, local religious freedom. He just didn't do it for the Jews. He allowed the Babylonians, I'll go back to the map. He allowed the Babylonians to worship anyone they wanted to worship. That's what he would do. Rather than imposing Persian gods, his gods, over the people, he just said, you do whatever you want. He says it magnanimously, like, oh, I honor you, I honor your God. He actually says at one point, Yahweh, the God of Israel, has sent me to do this for you. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is it's a great way for people to not fight back. I mean, that's really it. Honestly, Joe the schmo over here, Daryl the blacksmith and, Brad the shepherd, they really don't care about all the religious stuff. They just want to know, are you going to leave me alone? But if you start saying you actually have to worship a different God, that's like their eternal destiny now. And so that's what would lead. So a lot of people think it was just sort of a way to pacify the kingdoms. But in the history of Iran and the history of the Middle East, it's very interesting. Because really, this document that sort of sets it all up, and I'm going to go back to another picture here in a second. This thing right here that looks now, as I'm looking at it, suspiciously like a big piece of corn, it is not. It is a clay cylinder. And on this, in this cuneiform writing right here, is in fact that exact decree. This is a copy of the decree that's mentioned in Ezra, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Job. Ezra 1:1. In the first year, Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it in writing. This is that thing. This is the proclamation in writing. I think that's very cool. This was found in like a Babylonian temple. They've made, probably hundreds of copies of it, and sent it throughout the kingdom. And the idea was this. This is what he says. Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judea. So what he does is he allows people to go back. So this is Ezra, and Ezra and Zerubbabel are kind of in this time frame. He allows them to go back. He gives them all of the temple furniture back. So if you remember from a few weeks ago, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and basically burned it to the ground, remember King Hezekiah had shown the Babylonians around. He's like, look at all this great temple furniture. Look at all this gold. And Isaiah said, hey, they're going to take everything that you showed them. And he's like, it's not my problem. It's the next guy's problem, which that's probably the first real form of term limits, and political thinking. That's not my problem. I'm going to make it. Who cares about the next guy? So Cyrus actually gives all of it back. So he gives them all the temple furniture back. So this is the menorah, the altar of incense, everything. And he also gives them lumber materials, specifically cedars from Lebanon, which is very high-end wood, essentially. So he actually allows, not only does he allow for the temple to be rebuilt, he funds it. And this is pretty crazy stuff, to be perfectly honest with you. No one really saw this coming. This is not how rulers of the ancient world worked. So other things in this decree, there are things like religious liberty in this decree. So in some ways, Cyrus is sort of lauded and identified as basically the first humanitarian. This is the first document that ever outlines, in terms of the existing, this is the oldest copy of anyone talking about human rights, basic human rights. Now, we know that human rights existed on certain levels, but this is the document that talks about it. And so it's just very kind of interesting. His name in Persian is Koros, or Koros. His name in Hebrew is Koresh. So if that name sounds familiar, does that name sound familiar? The reason David Koresh called himself David Koresh is he saw himself as the second coming of King David and of King Cyrus. So he took the name David Koresh, just in case you're wondering. Okay, so that's where it comes from. So he is called in Isaiah 44:28, he is called Raha, or the shepherd. And in Isaiah 45:1, I don't know why that's not in there. In 45:1, he is called, and this word is pronounced Messiah. So he's called the Anointed One. He's the only other person in the Bible who is referred to as the Anointed One. So that's why I wanted to juxtapose these two guys off of each other. You have the servant who is an image of the Messiah, but you have Cyrus who is a pre-fulfillment of Messiah. What does he do? He delivers, he returns from exile, he restores. Now, he is not the Messiah. I'm not saying that. But he is an example of how there are prophetic things that can be fulfilled in a form or in a shadow or in a type in one person, but then have an ultimate realization in another person. Okay? So we've had that twice now in Isaiah. We have it with Cyrus as Messiah, and we have it with Mahar-shalal-Habaz, yes, from Isaiah 6, who is the child born to the virgin who will be named Emmanuel, even though his name is Mahar-shalal-Habaz. Okay, but so we have it twice. Both people whose prophesies hint at a greater thing. Those fulfillments are partial, but they're ultimately realized in Jesus Christ. And that's why Cyrus is so critical. Cyrus is also critical because he is the ultimate demonstration of God using whoever he wants, however he wants, to accomplish his means. Okay? And that's a huge theme in Isaiah. All of these guys, all of these kings think that God is favoring them, allowing them to conquer the Jews, allowing them to bring judgment on the Jews. But the truth is that they are all in some ways pawns at God's hand to bring about his purpose in the lives of his people. It's just very fascinating. They think that their power struggles are going to seal their place in history. They're going to be this thing. What they don't realize, that the biblical perspective is that God is allowing you to do, God is the one using you He is called literally a shepherd. He's called anointed, and he is called in another verse an instrument. So God sees him as an instrument. You are an extension of my rule and my will. The other thing about Cyrus is Cyrus, in juxtaposition to the suffering servant that we'll get to here in about 4 or 5 more minutes, Cyrus just saves the children of Israel. The suffering servant, as we will see, is here to save humanity. And I think there's something incredibly powerful there. Power, strength, political might, military might, economic might, all of that kind of stuff, it may save a people for a season, but only God can save the world. And there's this interplay between these two being compared to each other. All right, I promised I'd talk a little bit about it, so here we are. Cyrus was more than likely a Zoroastrian. What is Zoroastrianism, you ask? Funny, I'm glad you asked. Okay. The reason, now some of you have no idea why some are giggling and some are like, why is it okay? For years, my go-to explain another religion has been Zoroastrianism because the word makes me laugh, and there's not a lot of them. And then I found out that one of the most pivotal figures in all of Jewish history and the Bible, Cyrus, was a Zoroastrian. So I started digging into it, and it's not true, but it's kind of interesting. All right, so let me break it down for you. How many of you ever heard the song, and I was talking to some of the young people. That's what, when you're a youth pastor, you call them students. When you're my type of pastor, you call them young people, right, in case you're wondering. Some of you are going, I don't understand why he doesn't call me young people. The reason why is because you're not a young person. Okay, all right. So I was talking to some of the young people. If you've ever heard the song that goes, bum, 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 doom, 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 doom. You all know that one? We're not going to play it. Don't worry. Some of you are like, Brian, the only reason you know that's because that's the music Ric Flair came out to. Don't get distracted. Okay, but it's that music. That music is called also Spock Zarathustra, or Thus Spoke Zoroaster. That entire set of music is about Zoroastrianism. So that's one place it's touched your life, okay? So what is Zoroastrianism? No one really knows, but about 1,000 years before, remember how I talked about how timelines, no one really gets bogged down to them? But sometime about 1,000 years before, a prophet named Zoroaster was revealed to him that there were only 2 real powers of the universe. So the pagan deities, all of them out there, they were either good gods, or they were either good, essentially angels, or they were bad angels, all at the service of the good God and the bad God, okay? So what we have here is a form of religion called dualism. Dualism teaches that there's good and there's bad. There's light and there's dark, right? And that those yin and yang, that type of thing, and that those are equally opposing forces, okay? There's the light side and the dark side of the force. Like there's all, it's everywhere. And by the way, that's pretty much, most people kind of feel that way. What's fascinating is that neither Judaism nor Christianity actually teach that. They do not teach an equality between good and evil. They teach that God is only good, and anything that defies him is evil in the fact that it is not good. So it's more like shadow and light than black and white, right? Because shadow doesn't exist. Shadow is simply where light isn't. You tracking with me? Okay. So for Judeo-Christianity, it was always, there are wicked things, there is darkness, but evil is just where good isn't. Therefore, evil cannot be as powerful as good, okay? Zoroastrianism says, nope, right down the middle, 50-50. Zoroaster says, I'm going to follow the God of light, I'm going to follow the God of fire, that's what I'm going to do, and he does it. And I really, really think, Brian. Okay, the God's name was Ahura Mazda. Okay? Mazda. And you're like, wait, you mean like the car? I mean exactly like the car. Because the symbol of Ahura Mazda was a flaming set of wings. So if you look on the back of a Mazda, there's a little set of wings. That's because they're playing off of the imagery of Zoroastrianism. That's it. So you see it every day. Anybody here drive a Mazda? You're like, I don't want to admit that I drive a pagan god's car. Okay, all right, thank you. We'll have an altar call later. So what they believed is that the world was divided in sort of 3 blocks, okay? 3 blocks. Oh, man, even didn't bring my note sheet. So this is all from memory now. So they believed that the world was divided, or all of history divided into 3 blocks. There was like the first good block, which was about 1,000 years. Then there was the bad block, which is going on now 1,000 years. And then there'll be a good block of another 1,000 years when Ahura Mazda beats Ahura, the bad guy. And I forgot his name. I'm not even going to try. So he's going to beat him. And then there's all this morality. But ultimately, it's the goal to speak truth in whatever you do, is to defy evil. That's what you do. You fight against. The purpose of every being is to just accept the light, accept the truth, and don't believe lies. So that was a big part of their ethics. So it's all very interesting. There's a lot of other cool stuff about it. It's a fascinating religion. They legitimately have like all these little commands, and one of them, and I'm not lying to you, it's in their book. I think it's called the Yesara or the Yesera, something like that. And there's like a command against being violent to otters. Like you got to leave. Like otters are protected animals in Zoroastrianism. They're called river dogs, and you got to leave the river dog alone. So by that, anyway, the other thing about Zoroastrianism is it was sort of monotheistic. Zoroaster proclaimed there's only one God. Everything else is false and under him. But that God was still a part of a created order. He was one God who had won victory over the other gods. So what you'll hear sometimes, if you're into any kind of biblical scholarship, is people say, oh, Isaiah just stole a bunch of this stuff, and they stole the imagery from, there's some subtle things about Zoroastrianism, they took it. But the differences are so stark that there's no way. Plus, Isaiah is saying some of these themes hundreds of years before Cyrus is ever even in the picture. So it speaks more to Judaism's effect as it spread throughout the world. So that is Zoroastrianism. The next time you hear that song, also Spach Zarathustra, the next time you see a Mazda, just know it has influenced my life. In case you wonder, can I convert to Zoroastrianism? No. It's also an ethnic religion. So there you go. All right. That's it. So that's Cyrus. Boom, boom, did the thing. All right. So let's talk about, turn in your Bibles if you have a copy of it with you tonight, Isaiah chapter 52. There will be a lot of familiar verses tonight. What we have is at the end of this, we've jumped quite a few chapters since last week, but what we have is structurally we're at the end of a great sort of martial victory. God as warrior is winning, okay? And at the end of Isaiah 52, actually in verse 12, Isaiah writes, "For you shall not go out in haste, you shall not go in flight. The Lord Yahweh will go before you. The God of Israel will be your rear guard." So what he's saying is, when you leave from exile, you won't be retreating. You won't be scurrying. God is for you, and God is the one taking care of your back, okay? So it's very militaristic language. So up until now, all of the discussion, really in Isaiah, in many ways, has been about the power and the strength of God over the other gods, right? We've hit that theme multiple times over the last several weeks. God wins. God defeats the other gods. The other gods are jokes. The other gods aren't even real. God is more powerful. Everything's been about power. Everything's been about power. And then in verse 13, Isaiah's oracle starts with the word behold. And what he's saying is he immediately grabs your attention, okay? This passage, Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12, is divided into 5 stanzas, and all 5 stanzas have 3 verses. So it's actually very structured. So we'll go 3 verses at a time, okay? Stanza 1 is chapter 52, verses 13 through 15. The first stanza reflects on the shocking treatment of God's servant. What do I mean by that? It starts with this. So again, I just want us all to get there mentally. Most of the prophecies up to this point have been about the suffering of Israel, okay, and the victory and the power and the strength of God. God is so powerful that he can actually use other nations to do his will, all right? But then out of Isaiah's mouth, through the inspiration of God, comes the word, behold. My servant shall act wisely. The word for wisely is yaskil. It's this idea of wisdom that leads to success. So he says, now behold, pay attention. This servant is going to be successful, which is a stark contrast from almost every other prophet that has ever been called. Right? We talked about that in the first couple of weeks. Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Malachi, Micah, almost all of them, nobody listened to them. They said they were successful in obedience, but they weren't, quote unquote, successful in outcome. Okay? They didn't have the numbers, right? They didn't have the decision cards at the end of the meeting. You know what I mean? Their count was low. They couldn't go to Prophets Conference and be like, oh, we're multi-site and we have 4 venues. You know, they couldn't do any of that. Sorry, that's insider baseball humor. But he says, my servant will be successful. And he's like, yeah, of course, he's your servant. And he shall be high and lifted up. This phrase, high and lifted up, in the Old Testament only appears in Isaiah. And every time it appears in Isaiah, it's talking about God himself. So God is already drawing a connection between his own divinity and that of his servant. High and lifted up, and shall be exalted. And I would imagine if you're hearing this, you're like, yeah, of course he will. He's the servant of God. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. And all of a sudden, this prophecy takes a shocking turn. Because up until Isaiah, if they hadn't been paying attention, but up until Isaiah, no one ever thought the Messiah would suffer. They just assumed he would win. And now, Isaiah is saying, there is a servant coming whose victory comes, and he'll be beaten so badly, he won't even look, this is honestly what it's saying, he won't even look like a human being. He won't look like someone who is birthed of men. And he shall sprinkle many nations. Now that's kind of a weird one. That sounds strange. The word is yazah. And what it means is it's atonement language. His blood, essentially, the end result of his beating, the blood that comes from the violence done to him will, like Old Testament, there was, you sprinkled the blood, that will be sprinkled on the nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them, they see, and that which they have not heard, they understand. His testimony will be so powerful that even if they've never heard it or seen it, the influence of this servant will reach them. Isaiah, the gaze of Isaiah has jumped beyond the petty kings and the politics of the next 100, 150 years. Isaiah is seeing not only into hundreds of years into Israel's future, but he is in fact seeing into eternity at this point. When people think of prophecy, that's where we're at now. This is a prophecy that's saying there is something coming that will be so startling to you, it is in fact unbelievable. Now, we sit here and say, well, I believe it. That's because we're watching it in reverse. We have the most spoiler-filled life in the world. We literally know how the whole thing's going to end. Isaiah is saying and talking about these things for the very first time. These ideas and these concepts are coming out. That which you have heard. So stanza 1 deals with the shocking treatment of God's servant, that he will be successful in spite of the suffering and abuse. And it is this shocking pivot to the literal physical violence that the servant will have to endure. So Isaiah has grabbed your attention at this point, or the prophecy has grabbed your attention, which then goes on to the next stanza, verses 1 through 3. Who has believed what they have heard from us? Who has believed what they have heard from us? So in this stanza, we're dealing with, because of his suffering, the servant will be dismissed and disregarded by humanity. So think about it. All the language, again, I'll reiterate the point, all the language has been about the victory and the strength of God. Now he's saying, my servant will experience great suffering and violence. And because of that, even though he will be successful, wisdom towards success, he will be dismissed. The violence will be the thing. The suffering will be the thing that will cause people to kind of have a hard time with him. Okay? Verse 1. Who has believed what he has heard from us? In other words, Isaiah is reminding Israel in some ways that their mission has always been to talk about Yahweh and his love for people. And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? We have that language, if you remember back from the Hezekiah stuff. That's the strength and the power of God. Verse 2, for he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. Early on in this study, and because this has been 12 weeks, I can literally say a couple of months ago when we started, we talked about Isaiah and agricultural references. So Isaiah brings that back now, okay? And he says this, he grew up, Isaiah 53:2, he grew up like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. We've talked about, quote unquote, this guy before, Isaiah 11:1. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse and a branch from his roots. So now, when you can have the luxury of reading Isaiah in itself, in context to itself, you begin to see this language is so similar. This is a tree that's in a hiking trail I used to go to in Washington. And you can see this tree's been lumbered, it's been felled. And then out of this tree has grown this entire new tree. It grew right out of the stump. It was a shoot that came up out of the stump, and that grew. And that's what he's saying. Israel will be mowed down. Israel will be cleared out. But out of that will come this stump. And what we're doing now is we're seeing at the end of all of this, if someone were to just sit down and read Isaiah, they would begin to tie all of this stuff together. Okay? They'd say, oh, wait, I remember he talked about a stump, but it was from Jesse. So that must mean that the servant would have to come from the tribe of Jesse, which means David. Right? So he's starting to put it all together. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and had no beauty that we should desire him. I don't know. That's just interesting. Because it's kind of saying that this servant would not be a good-looking guy. And so for some of us, we're like, see, God can use anybody. I think it's interesting, though, because it could speak to the vanity of humanity, that we just like to follow attractive, pretty things. And he's saying he will be so beaten. He will not be what you want him to be. And he will not be what you expect him to be. Verse 3, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. It's so fascinating because, as you can see, Isaiah is moving between future and past language. He will, he was. It's just really cool stuff. That word despised kind of it's not the best choice of words. It's a little bit better to say he'll be dismissed. It's not that these kings and these nations will hate him, it's that he'll just be ignored. It talks more to the credibility of the servant rather than people being disgusted by him. And so what happens is we read that and we think, oh, that means they're going to hate. And what they do in a sort of way, but that word just right there tends to mean more dismissed. And acquainted with grief. Yada is the word for acquainted. It means this deep knowledge. He internally completely comprehends grief. And that grief word, illness, wound, it is a grief that comes from being sick. That's the type of grief. Not literally, but just that image of grief. You know, where you've just been sick for so long. Am I ever going to get... It's like that type of sick that just settles inside of you. And he says, that's who this servant will be. He will know that, and he will get that. Why is this important? Because Israel had been dealing up until this point from a place of suffering. And the easy thing would be to just send another earthly king to violently solve this temporal problem. So he does that. He solves it through Cyrus. I will deal with this finite problem now. But what God is saying is he's saying, I now am putting into place the means by which we will deal with the only problem. And that's the separation between man and God. I'll deal with your issue here. Cyrus, let him go. Cyrus, I'll let you go. You know, and then later, Xerxes, hey, can we build our walls back up? Yes, Nehemiah, go. And then it just goes on and on and on. And the Persians are actually quite good. To them, they're not great, but they're good to the Jewish people. Okay, anyway. So they go along. But what God is saying in this passage is that it's this: we have to deal with the real problem. Because the problem is not violence, the problem isn't sickness, the problem isn't illness, the problem isn't how horrible we are to each other. Those are problems, but the problem is this gap, is this separation between God and man. So the way God solves that is not through a conquest, okay, but through shared suffering. And nobody saw that coming, right? Because come on. Someone fights you, you fight them back, and you win, hopefully, or you lose. That's how you deal with stuff. The idea that God says, here's how I'm going to fix it. I'm going to come in from the inside, and I'm just going to show you how to live above it, beyond it, without it, so that the things of this earth can't even touch you anymore. You're like, well, isn't it better to just get rid of the stuff? Yeah, but we'll get there eventually. But if I get rid of all this stuff too early, then there will be all these people who will never have a chance to fall in love with God, to fall in love with Jesus. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send someone, and what he's going to do, because the only way to really deal with all this sin is punishment, right? The wages of sin is death. Someone has to pay the price. God just can't write off the account. You say, well, that'd be really nice. Why not? Because if he just doesn't deal with it, then he's not just. And if he's not just, he's not righteous. That's the tension. See, we want God to be just to other people. We want him to be merciful to us, right? And we're like, God, have mercy on me. I know I shouldn't have been speeding, and I know, and God, and then you start crying, and the cops let you off, and then anyway, that's a whole other set of things, But then someone parks in your parking spot, and you're like, you got to ring that guy up. I want his job, right? The level of disrespect, right? So when we're wronged, we want justice. When we wrong, we want mercy, right? It's human nature. And for those of you who don't deal with this, I'm very proud of you. But for the humans in the room, this can be a problem, okay? And so what does God do? God says, I have to deal with the problem. I can't ignore or dismiss the problem. And the problem is that there's sin and it has to be dealt with. And the way that we think God should deal with sin is really it's pure justice, right? Which is what? Bad people go to hell, good people go to heaven. That's our solution. Until somebody says, well, what if we're all bad people? And you're like, well, I'm not as bad as this guy. Yeah, but you're also not as good as that guy. So if we're doing the comparison thing, it's what I like to call the Billy Graham problem. I'm not a bad guy. I've never robbed a bank. Unless I took a pen without realizing it. Like, I'm not a bad guy. I don't do bad things. Well, there's always Billy Graham, right? If I'm comparing myself, I don't want anything to be fair. Quit asking for the universe to be fair. Trust me when I say it's the last thing you want. The crazy thing is God says through this servant, it's still going to be fair. It's just going to be cosmologically unfair to one person. And he's willing to do it. So we go into the next passage, okay? We go into the next passage. Stanza 3. Not only does the servant suffer with humanity, he suffers for humanity. And this is where the radical language and the official theological term for it is substitutionary atonement. Up into this, it would all have been, no, just send a goat in there. And the goat's like, that's a bad idea. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody. No, I'm just a kid. Thank you. All right. Sorry, I didn't mean to get your goat with that joke. Sorry. I'm a dad. What can I say? This is what we do. Come on. It had all been like send the goat in, send the pigeon in, all that kind of stuff. But even Hebrews says the problem is that you just sin again. So now there's just got to be more goats. There's got to be more bulls. There's got to be more pigeons. There's got to be more of that. And God actually gets, in Isaiah, he's the one who says, I'm sick of the rivers of blood. We need a different solution. And our humanity says, well, then the solution should just be get over it. Let me off the hook. But come on, those of us who have more than one kid, if you let one kid off the hook, the other kid will come at you with the hook. Like that's how it works, So this is his solution. Surely. That's a word that's not used a lot. And it's in the same class of words as behold. So it's an attention-getting word. It doesn't sound like that, but in Hebrew it was an attention-getting word. In other words, this is it. This is what you need to hear. He has borne our griefs and he's carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. That's the solution. The solution is not someone who would come from outside our world and rescue us. It was someone who would come from the outside into the deepest parts of humanity and lead us out by carrying all of our junk. Because we can't carry it. And the only one who can is God. This is what we call, if you remember, we've used this word, this is what we call a chiasm. I mentioned that last week, so let me show you how the chiasm works so that we pay attention to the middle statement, okay? A statement. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Borne, carried, laid on him, griefs, sorrows, iniquity. Look at what the poem does there. It says, here is the source of your grief and sorrow. The grief and the sorrow is your sin. All the grief and sorrow in this world, in some form or fashion, could perhaps be the result of iniquity, of sin. Okay? Not all of it. Some of it is just natural tragedy, and we deal with that. I want to be careful when I say that. But for them, he's borne our griefs, he's carried our sorrow, laid on him iniquity. Grief, sorrow, iniquity. Yet, we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. All we have gone astray, we have turned everyone to his own way. In other words, we have ignored the servant. Even when we've seen him, we go everyone to his own way. But, surely, yet, but. So the way that these all work in harmony, this is basically setting it up. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. The fundamental solution is that the punishment for our sin must be dealt with. And the sacrificial system up until that point had basically been minimum payments on the credit card, right? Just minimum payments. Here's my $25 a month. Well, how much is the balance? $42,000. But I'm just going to keep doing $25 a month, Here's hoping. Come on, scratchers. Like that's what we're hoping for, right? And Jesus comes in and says, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to pay the whole thing. And we think, oh man, we got away with it. We did. He didn't. Okay? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who wrote The Cost of Discipleship, says it this way. Grace may be free, but it is not cheap. A huge price was paid. It is free to us. Right? And so people will be like, oh man, so at the coffee shop where my daughter works, she's having to work tonight, but at the coffee shop where my daughter works, I get a punch card every time I get a drink. And at the end of it, they say, you have a free drink. And I'm saying, that drink is actually the most expensive drink because it took 10 drinks to get that one. So that drink is like $50, right? That's not a free drink. That's what it is. Grace was free, but it was not cheap. What is the price of this salvation? Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. Right? That's where it comes from. And he bore it. And he just didn't pay it. He took it. And no one knows about Jesus in that sense yet. No one has heard anybody talk about this. All we've had are what? We've had the, after the fall in the garden, we have the killing of the animal. We have Cain and Abel, where an animal should have died instead of your plants. Sorry, Cain, the plants weren't enough. Life needed to be here. Okay, we had that. We had the promise in the garden that the woman would have a child and that it would crush the serpent's head, but it would bruise the person's heel. That's really it. We have the shadow and the type of a sacrifice. We have Abraham, God giving Abraham another sacrifice instead of having to sacrifice Isaac. Like we had these little windows, but no one had really put it all together. And then Isaiah is saying, it's him. It's this servant that's coming. And he's not here. And and when he comes, we will still ignore him. That's the brutal part. We esteemed him stricken. Again, look at how he is talking about the future in past tense. And that's really what prophecy is. In fact, you could make an argument that Jewish prophecy is really seeing the future as the past, as things that have already happened. We esteemed him. He calls it, we esteemed him. We did that, okay? So let's go on here. For what? And that word is shalom. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And we think about shalom and we're like, peace, like lack of conflict, like everything's okay. I want you to get rid of that concept of peace and start thinking of wholeness. A life without fracture. A world without fracture. A world, in some ways, that is undivided. A life that is undivided. So what is that? It looks like peace, because there's a wholeness that is required for peace, right? Prosperity, completeness, safeness, salvation, health. In other words, a state of lack of disease and a wholeness or well-being. Satisfaction, contentment, a friend, a companion, a blessing. It doesn't just mean peace. It means all of that glommed into one thing. And that's what he's here to bring us. That's what the servant is going to bring us. He's going to bring us all of that. But to get there, he suffers with us and for us. Because if he just suffered with us, that's a buddy, that's a friend, that's not a savior. Like, I have friends who will be miserable with me. And I have friends to which I will be, I will be miserable with, preposition. We do that, but I can't be miserable for them. Only God can do that, okay? His suffering will end a cycle of brokenness, leading to a completeness of wholeness, right? And really, it's almost like saying all of human history is like trying to progress with a wheel that's missing a little bit. So yeah, it kind of goes, and it goes ka-chunk, and goes ka-chunk, goes ka-chunk, goes ka-chunk, that type of thing. And Jesus is saying, I can complete this so that all of it is whole, it is complete, it moves forward. Okay? How is this accomplished? Upon him was the punishment that brought us peace, and then by his wounds, and the word is literally welts. I think that's critical. Why? Because a lot of people got beat up. But the specificity of the word welts, of the scars that come from being beaten, of the things that rise up, that is the word. And yet, when we translate it, we say his wounds, and I don't know why. It's welts, by his stripes. I got to be honest with you, King James comes through here. Oh, King James, it gets it right. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Why welts? Why stripes? Because of this. So we often hear about the cat of nine tails and the scourge. This is what's called a flagron or a flagellum. The word would be translated scourge. I try to find one. This is probably one of the oldest ones that actually exists. The problem is they're usually made out of bone or rawhide, and so they decompose. This one, those are bronze and copper. Okay, and then you have the handle there. This is an ancient sketch. This isn't a drawing. This is a sketch of a carving. Okay, so this is like a pencil sketch of a carving that showed what ancient crucifixion looked like. Part of it, if you notice, is the striping on the back. So it's fascinating that in some ways, not only does the prophecy say it's going to happen, down to the point of the means by which it would happen. Now, crucifixion wasn't a thing at this point. The Assyrians kind of dabbled with it, but the Romans perfected it. The Romans perfected crucifixion. The Romans could keep people alive on a cross for weeks. Weeks. The record, according to ancient, there's an ancient account of a man being alive on a cross for 2 weeks. And being so fatigued. I don't want to get it, but just, it was horrific, okay? And I think we all understand that. What he's saying is that why do I harbor on this? Because you need to look at the power of the prophecy itself. It's not just a general statement that a nice guy is going to go through rough stuff. Isaiah prophetically is actually saying what in fact will actually happen. So there is a specificity that validates the prophecy historically. It is also teaching us theologically. It's not just giving us history or the future as history. It's teaching us the theology of it. That this is a swap. This is an exchange. That's why all throughout the New Testament, Paul especially uses words like redemption, ransom, debt. It's a swapping out. Justice is served. No one got away with it. Sometimes older Christians or people who've been in the faith for a long time struggle when someone who's really been kind of a rotten turd gets saved. And we're like, that's not fair, right? There's this big thing, and I'll maybe get a little controversial, I don't know. But Netflix just ran this big sort of movie documentary about Jeffrey Dahmer, right? One of the crazy things about Jeffrey Dahmer is there's a story, Jeffrey Dahmer, serial killer, cannibal, all sorts of things. I mean, really horrible, horrible things. But allegedly, he converted to Christianity before he died. And a lot of us would say, that's not fair. And so I was just talking with Kelly. And I don't know and people are like, well, what do you think? I have no idea what I think. I try to think about Jeffrey Dahmer as little as possible. Right? I'm like, let's go back to Apple News. That's it. But who am I to say? I've never done any of those things, but I've done enough. You've never done any of those things, but you've done enough. And what it is God is trying to get them to understand that it's not about being fair, it's about being just. But the justice, if it's going to be for everyone, it has to be for everyone. So much so that Jesus later would tell a story about guys who get hired at the beginning of the day. And these guys come to work for a farmer, and he hires a group of men at the beginning of the day. And then right before the day's over, another group of guys comes up. And they work for him for just a few hours. And the farmer pays them both the same. And nobody in this room thinks that's fair. Because it's not. But it's not about what you deserve. It's about what he's willing to give. Trust me when I say, none of us want what we deserve. My old Bible college professor used to say it this way. All we deserve is death, hell, and the grave. Anything else is grace. Well, I deserve to have this in my life. I deserve to be more famous. I deserve to be promoted. And we throw our rights around like we have some standing. Isaiah is saying not only will he suffer with you, but far more importantly than suffering with you, this servant is actually suffering for you. And the thing is that there will be people who will actually despise him for doing it, who won't pay attention to him. Paul brings this up in Corinthians when he says the cross is a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Greeks. Okay. The next stanza goes on. Stanza 4, verses 7 and 9. The fourth stanza emphasizes the submission, innocence, and injustice of the servant. What happens next is now the prophecy of the oracle comes out and he really starts laying in, but you have to know he's innocent. They really, and that he submitted to it. He was oppressed, verse 7, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. It is the endurance of injustice on our behalf. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, now we have that ritual sacrificial imagery, now that's also thrown in. So it's just this incredible weaving of tons of different images to bring about not a precise picture, but if you think of it this way, as a mosaic, right? Like a beautiful mosaic, where you kind of have to, if you look at it, all you're going to see is like that one tile, and it's not going to make any sense. But if you step back, you see the whole picture. Or those like posters that you can get, like at 4th of July, and it's a bunch of flags, but it makes a big flag, and then you look, and it's like a bunch of little things. Like, oh. But if you spend all the time looking at that one thing, you step back, you miss the whole thing. I want to pay attention to the lamb. If you pay too much attention to the lamb, you'll miss the servant. You'll do all that, so you step back. Like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Incredibly specific detail of the prophecy comes true in the trial of Jesus. He says very little in his trial. And when he does say something, it's actually incredibly provocative. They say that you are the son, they say that you are the Son of Man, that you're the King of the Jews. And Jesus literally says, hey, you said it, not me. Like he's provoking them. He's trying to get them to demonstrate their violence towards him, not in a masochistic way, but in a way that says, I am doing this. Okay? By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation who considered that he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people, what he's saying is that even the people who will travel with the servant will think that he has abandoned them and been taken away, which is exactly what happens. But here's the critical thing about the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And I know I'm going long, just give me 5 more minutes. The sacrifice of Jesus Christ as it applies to the suffering servant is what we always have to remember. No one did anything to Jesus. Go back and read those accounts very carefully, and you will see that Jesus is running the show the whole time. He has every opportunity to flee, and he stays. He has every opportunity to sort of, oh, I don't know what you guys are talking about, and instead, he pushes farther. He didn't have to let those people bring him in on a donkey's colt. He would have known that would have triggered things. Bringing a person into Jerusalem, Passover week, on the foal of a donkey? You're screaming, I think I'm the Messiah. So he does it. Like there's all this stuff that goes on. Jesus is in control the whole time. Pastor Tim Keller, someone I greatly admire, preaches about this. He has this whole sermon series on this, and it just shook me to the core. He said this: they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death. Who does he go to who does he die with? 2 thieves, 2 rebels, 2 terrorists, depending on how you translate the word. 2 violent, brutal men. Where is he buried? Well, we know from Matthew chapter 27, verses 57-ish through 61, he's buried in Joseph's tomb. Some of you only know that because of the song. They laid him down in Joseph's tomb, but it's in the Bible also. Joseph of Arimathea was, in fact, a very rich man. Jesus was not. He didn't have a tomb, so he is buried in the borrowed tomb of a rich man. He is with a rich man in his death. Specificity and the detail. And sometimes with prophecy, people are like, well, of course they wrote it like that. It came true later. This is still 500 years before Jesus. Anyway, the key part of this verse, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. The innocence is critical. Okay? And finally, stanza 5, the final stanza reveals the explanation for the suffering. Why all this suffering? It is the redemption of mankind. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. And it's not just crush. Again, these word pictures are so powerful. It is a crushing, it is a humiliation. He is humiliated. He has put him to grief, the halal, that weakness. He broke him down. When his soul makes an offering for guilt. He explains it right there. All of this suffering sets him up to be a sacrifice. And a sacrifice stands in for guilty sinners. Okay? The will of the Lord shall prosper his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By the knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous. Atonement, substitutionary atonement. He makes us righteous. The old Reformed way of talking about it is forensic justification. You are righteous because he says so, not because you are. Right? So if you say, what does that mean? It's a little bit like if you know anything about baseball. The strike zone in baseball is totally up to the discretion of the umpire. A ball or a strike is not a ball or a strike because of where it lands in the strike zone. A ball or a strike in baseball is that because it's proclaimed that by the umpire. It doesn't matter where it lands. If the umpire says it's a strike, it's a strike. That's why you can't argue balls and strikes. The umpire is, in fact, infinite and infallible in that moment. Okay, and some of you are like, I think I knew some umpires like that. But it's true. We are not righteous before God because we're great. We're righteous before God because he said we are. We're declared that. We're not innocent. We're not righteous. We're horrible, rotten creatures that are evil to each other. But God says, you are my beloved son. You are more than a conqueror. You are a mighty warrior. You know, like, that can't be true. It doesn't matter if you think it's true. God said it was true, therefore it is true. But look at the facts. Who cares about the facts? Pay attention to the truth. And the truth is you are, in fact, who God says you are. And he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many or the great, And he shall divide the spoil with the strong. So now, if you read in John chapter 3, as Jesus is talking about himself to Nicodemus, he actually talks about the Son of Man being exalted, being raised up. So his stature will be raised because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. And in verse 13 or verse 12 of 53, we flip all the way back to verse 13 of chapter 52. My servant shall act wisely and be astonished. He's being acted wisely, and he will bury. Not just with, again, he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. Not just with, but for. He just doesn't suffer with us, he suffers for us. He just doesn't walk with our sin, he endured it for our sin. And this, as you see, is why in the book of Acts, there's a man traveling. He's a eunuch from Ethiopia. And he's reading a scroll. And he doesn't understand it, but he knows that something's going on. And Philip happens to be there. And Philip, the apostle, starts witnessing and talking to him. And the man is reading the 53rd, he is reading this passage. And because of this passage, Philip, who walked with Jesus, said, I can draw a straight line and not have to make up a single detail. This came true, and he was my friend. Let me tell you about it. And then the man says, is there water nearby? Where can I be baptized? It's an incredibly powerful story, and it comes from this prayer in the suffering servant. Let's pray. God, thank you for your grace and mercy, and for these folks' grace and mercy, for going a little bit later tonight. We love you. We thank you. We pray that you would speak to us now in our discussion time. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right. Go ahead and enjoy your discussion.